All right, let's get started. What we're going to do here is a doctrinal analysis of the Republican offensive against Oviedo, focusing on that critical window of February and March 1937. And just to be clear, our entire examination is based strictly on the operational data and planning documents from that period. Okay, here's how we'll break this down. First, we'll look at the plans and forces on both sides. Then we'll walk through the development of the offensive itself. From there, we'll analyze the crisis point and the nationalist reaction. And finally, we'll wrap up with an analysis of the results and the long-term strategic consequences.
All right, so let's set the stage. We'll start with the strategic situation and the operational plans that both high commands put together before things kicked off.
So, the Republican concept of maneuver, it was all spelled out in their General Order of Operations, number 20. Basically, they designated Asturias as the main effort for the Army of the North. And to back that up, the plan was for the Euzkadi Army Corps to throw in 2 brigades, the Santander Corps would provide 1, and they'd also commit heavy artillery and all their available air power.
Now, the specific objectives were laid out in 4 very distinct stages. Step 1, cut the Oviedo-Grado corridor. Simple enough. Step 2, destroy the enemy forces you've just encircled. Step 3, establish a solid defensive front just west of Escamplero. And only then, as the final 4th stage, was the plan to actually occupy Oviedo itself, hitting it from all directions.
Now, in contrast, you have the Nationalist command under General Mola. They'd worked up a 2-phase counterplan. Phase 1 was all about reaction, relieve the pressure on Oviedo, secure the approaches. But Phase 2, well, that was offensive. The idea was to then push forward and capture the key ports of Avilés and Gijón.
And to pull this off, the Republican High Command brought together a really formidable force. We're talking 5 full divisions, and that includes those reinforcements coming in from the Santander and Basque fronts. You really have to understand, this was the largest single force that either side had assembled in the war up to that point, a huge undertaking.
So when you add it all up, the Republican manpower for this offensive was going to top out at around 70,000 troops, and they had 170 artillery pieces to back them up. The bottom line is, this gave them a significant numerical superiority over the defenders. Okay, so that's the setup. Let's move on to the execution phase now and look at how this whole offensive unfolded, starting with the first moves on February 16th.
So, the operation didn't start with one single decisive blow. Instead, what we saw was a series of probing attacks between the 16th and the 19th. Now, the tactical reason for these probes isn't really clear, but the strategic consequence, well, it was disastrous. They completely gave up the element of surprise. This allowed General Aranda to shift 10 battalions out of his reserve and plug them right into his most critical defensive spots.
All right, so on February 21st, the main offensive finally kicks off. We have 25 battalions hitting the nationalist positions all along the corridor, and the fighting was brutal. The attackers took and gave heavy casualties. We're estimating 2,000 to 3,000 for the Republicans and over 700 for the Nationalists, just on that one day. But for all that, they only managed to take a few isolated positions. The defensive lines, they held.
The very next day, February 22nd, the pressure is still on, and it's relentless. And this is where the Republican forces get their first, real, significant operational success. They seize Loma Pando. This was a huge deal because it was a direct fulfillment of their plan. That position dominated the main road, and by taking it, they effectively cut Oviedo's primary line of communication to its rear.
Now, over the next few days, from the 23rd to the 25th, the situation for the defenders inside Oviedo becomes absolutely critical. The city is getting hammered by incessant, overwhelming artillery fire. The attacks are relentless, all along the entire line. By the 25th, the Nationalists had already taken 2,000 casualties inside Oviedo alone. It was a desperate situation.
Okay, we're now at the decisive phase of the operation. This period, from the end of February to the middle of March, this is the crisis point for the Republican offensive, and it's where we start to see an effective nationalist reaction. Starting on February 26th, the Republican offensive just stalls. It really grinds to a halt. A major attack on San Claudio on the 27th, this one had 6 battalions in armor. It gets thrown back with enormous losses. You know things are going badly when they decide to decree a general mobilization in Asturias. That's a clear signal that the operation is just chewing through manpower at a rate they can't sustain, and they're just not hitting their objectives.
And just to give you a sense of the intensity here, one of the sources describes the action on March 2nd like this. Speaking about San Claudio, it says, quote, "Up to 14 assaults are launched, a veritable carnage ensues.
I mean, that phrase, a veritable carnage, it really captures the brutal attritional nature of this fight and just how futile these repeated frontal assaults were against a dug-in defense.
Then, starting on March 5th, the initiative completely shifts. The Nationalists go on the offensive, launching a counterattack with a mixed brigade. Their goals are to relieve pressure on the corridor and, crucially, to retake Loma Pando. Now, they met fierce resistance, and they didn't achieve all of their objectives, but what they did do was effectively break the momentum of the Republican assault. By March 19th, the offensive was officially over.
All right, so we've walked through the timeline of events. Let's step back now and do a proper doctrinal analysis of the operation's outcome, looking at the casualties and the final tactical situation.
So from a doctrinal standpoint, what went wrong here? The Republican offensive was really marked by three critical errors. First, you have a dispersion of effort. They were attacking all along the line instead of focusing on a single main thrust. Second, a failure in the economy of force. They just didn't concentrate their superior combat power at the decisive points. And finally, and this is probably the most important one, they failed to stick to their own plan, their own concept of maneuver. They launched these costly, premature attacks on Oviedo before they had definitively cut and secured the corridor.
And you can see the cost of these doctrinal failures when you look at the casualty figures. The Nationalist forces recorded just under 5,400 total casualties. In stark contrast, Republican losses are estimated to be around 25,000 men. Think about that. That's a nearly 5-to-1 loss ratio. I mean, just a devastating outcome for an attacking force.
But here's the irony. Despite this incredibly costly victory for the Nationalists, the final tactical situation for the defenders was still precarious. We have a report from General Aranda himself, dated March 6th, and he makes it clear that Oviedo was still in an untenable situation. Their lines of communication were fragile, their forces were outnumbered. He basically says the survival of the salient had more to do with the enemy's lack of military skill than it did with their own defensive strength.
So let's wrap this up by zooming out and looking at the wider strategic consequences. What did this failed offensive mean for the broader campaign for the North?
To put it simply, the failure at Oviedo was a strategic turning point. The source material says it best, quote, "The failure of the great offensive on Oviedo represents the end of a very important stage in our war. The North is going to change hands." End quote. This defeat just completely exhausted the offensive capacity of the Republican Army of the North. After this, the strategic initiative passed definitively to the Nationalists.
And just so you know, for anyone who wants to do a deeper dive on this or other campaigns, all the source material for this analysis comes from the extensive project by Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo, which you can find at www.battalionsguerracivil.es.
So I'll leave you with a final critical question to consider. When you look at the massive Republican superiority in both manpower and materiel, you have to ask, was it this failure of command and doctrine, and not a lack of resources, that was the single decisive factor that sealed the fate of the entire Northern Front? That's something to think about. This briefing is concluded.